Alrighty, so I guess this is it for today. We are going to start chapter 7, which deals with Rome specifically. The entire chapter goes through Rome. So in this case, we start because Rome is kind of divided into two periods, right? The Republican era, where it is formed as a republic, and then at some point, which is where most people tend to remember, Rome in its history converts into an empire. Okay, so starting at the beginning, and last chapter we mentioned a little bit about the legend behind Rome's founding. Doesn't really matter which one you want to believe or which one you buy into, whether it's the twin brothers raised by a she-wolf, or Romans are descendants of a Trojan prince and a Latin princess, and that Trojan prince happens to be part God. Okay, what we do know, all right, is that around the year 753 BC, a small village basically arises, and I know we'd have to go back to like chapter 1 and chapter 2, the whole, settle down and agriculture and start growing food and all of that happens. So we get to the village stage, okay? And the city or the village of Rome is established along a river, okay? A very small river, and it is surrounded by 7 different hills. So obviously its setup, its structure is different from places like Mesopotamia or Egypt or whatnot, okay? But similar, because of the geography, okay? Rome basically develops as an independent city-state. Okay, so it goes from village to town and into city, and then basically that's where it stays. And other places in Italy also, kind of remain that way. Now, yes, for a very brief time, Rome does, when it's like, a town, it does have a quote-unquote king, but that idea does not last, okay? And Rome is founded as, or at least the city of Rome, is founded as what is called a republic, okay? And, I've kind of explained it, we've talked about it a little, and in fact, that part right there, I literally copied and pasted it from the previous chapter, okay? Where it is a type of democracy, but it is not a pure democracy the way Athens was, where, it's the citizens that vote on pretty much everything. But in a republic, you vote for a representative, and that representative then is able to make the various decisions that need to be made, and at some point, somebody else gets voted in, or they get voted out, or they, withdraw from public service, etc. Okay? And so, the city of Rome is a republic, okay? And as the city of Rome begins to expand, because just like in other, Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and to a certain degree, the Greek city-states, they begin to expand outward and they begin to conquer some of the surrounding areas. And so, obviously, Rome focuses first on conquering the other city-states around it. And as they conquer those city-states, those areas become a part of the Roman Republic. Okay? Now, around the year 330 is when Rome begins its expansion, okay? So it basically takes about 400 years from the time, the Romans settled down. Okay. From the time the Romans settled down and, farmers and, not everyone has to farm and has to and all of that stuff, until it becomes a full-fledged city. They have their republican government in place, and they begin to conquer other places. Now, the first group they go after is a group of people known as the Etruscans. Okay, the Etruscans have just fought a war against Celtic invaders that, tried to, conquer Italy, and the Etruscans were able to fight them off. And so even though the Romans were in fact just a single city-state, maybe a little bit of area around it, okay, they are able to take down, this Etruscan kingdom, all right, and take them over and make them a part of their republic, okay? Once they do that, they begin to conquer other areas in Rome, okay? And in this case, the Etruscans were slightly different people than they were, whereas once they conquer the Etruscans, then they start conquering other groups, other Latin groups that are similar to them, okay? And so, over time, these groups mix, all right? And those of you who claim Italian heritage, you have some Latin, you have some Etruscan, maybe a little bit of Celtic type of thing, okay? And so, all right, Rome, just the map then, around the year 300, okay, they have conquered, here they are. They have conquered parts of the Etruscan kingdom. They've conquered, a couple of the Latin states, but they're still not the dominant power because, you still have the Phoenicians, you still have, the Greek city-states that have kind of like spread out into places, all right, and all of this good stuff, all right? Now, of course, as a society that is spending its time conquering the surrounding people, okay, they are a very militaristic society. Even though they are a republic, okay, the representatives are basically choosing to go out and conquer these other people, all right? And so from its very beginning, the Roman military, carried a certain ethos, okay? Number one, never ever accept defeat, okay? You fight to the last man. If you actually surrender and get taken prisoner, then you just might as well never come back, all right? Because we'll kill you, all right, for having surrendered, okay? Speaking of killing, one of the ways that they instill discipline in their soldiers is that pretty much any infraction was the death penalty, okay? So obviously, if for the smallest thing, like, you forgot to clean your sword or something, was punishable by death, then surrendering and allowing yourself to be taken prisoner, then yes, definitely, you'd be dying for that. And so in this case, then, it made them fight all that much harder because, discipline had been harsh in their training as soldiers, okay? Now, just as an FYI, and this is, if you recall, if you think back to China, one of the innovations of the Shang Dynasty was the fact that they fought year-round, because that was not the norm. And in this case, the Romans, they always started their wars, or they always went back to the battlefield in the month of March. Okay, why the month of March? Well, because March is named after Mars, who was the god of war, okay? And so that's the month that you go to war, the month that is named after the war god, okay? By 275, so this is how, badass the Romans were. It takes them about 60 years to conquer all of Italy, okay? By 275, the Romans are now in control of all of Italy, all right? So, we're starting to develop a large state. And once they have conquered every other, I don't want to say Italian, because there's no such thing as Italians yet, but it's the closest thing I can say. Every other Italian group, okay, now their biggest rival is the city of Carthage, okay? if you recall, all right, we got to think back for a minute. Remember, and this was one of their contributions to history, the city of Carthage was built by the Phoenicians as a trading outpost, as a trading colony. Okay, long after the Phoenicians, were conquered, taken over, disappeared to history. Okay, the city of Carthage is still in existence. Okay, not only is it in existence, as we talked about in the last chapter, they have been influenced by the Greco-Egyptians, and so they have adopted Greek culture and become very Greekified. So, they're no longer the same as the original Phoenicians, but they have been able to conquer large portions of North Africa and a few parts of southern Spain. And so they are basically the dominant kingdom in that part of the Mediterranean. The Romans are the dominant ones in Italy and southern Europe. Okay, so invariably they are gonna go head to head, and this actually happens in Sicily. Okay, because the Romans are in green. Okay, the Romans have taken over all of Italy. Okay, the Carthaginian people are in blue, and now both of them are trying to take control of Sicily. Now, originally Sicily had been settled by Greek people, and so you do have various Greek cities and whatnot. And so obviously. In this case, we have then Rome and Carthage fighting over control of Sicily. All right? And so, as I've said before, I don't ask you to remember a lot of wars. I don't ask you to remember a lot of battles and whatnot. But this is one question I am going to ask you. All right? You do need to know what the Punic Wars were. Okay? Number one, the Punic Wars were 3 wars, okay? And the protagonists are Rome versus Carthage, okay? You don't need to know the dates, all right? It was basically 100 years of war. But you just need to know that it was Rome versus Carthage, and there were 3 of them, okay? Now, I don't need you to know very many specifics about each of the Punic Wars. And just as an FYI, if you ever do go and major in history and decide to take a class in Roman history, then yeah, you would have to go through each individual war and know all the shit and whatever. But this is the only thing you got to know for Mr. Santos. Number 1, okay, Punic War number 1, they fight over Sicily. Okay, that is the main conflict. And then, spoiler alert, Rome wins. Okay, that's why Sicily is Italian. Okay, the Romans win, and they take over all of Sicily. Okay, Punic War number 2. This is probably the most famous one because it's the one where the Carthaginian general Hannibal crosses into Europe with 60 elephants. And with those elephants, he takes them over the Alps and into Italy itself. Okay, and so it is like the first time that the Romans are invaded by a foreign power. Not only are they invaded by a foreign power, but there's these weird-looking, big-nosed animals that they've only ever heard of because of the Chronicles of Alexander and other Greek documents that they've picked up. Okay. Hannibal actually wanders around Italy for several years, destroying shit and, all this other stuff. The Romans have no idea how to beat him until one of the Roman generals basically says, you know what, if we send an army into Carthage, I know that we would leave everything defenseless here in Italy, but if we send all of our forces to Carthage, then Hannibal will be forced to withdraw and go to defend Carthage. And that's what the Romans do. Okay, and it works. As soon as Hannibal figures out that the Romans have withdrawn and gone to invade Carthage. He takes his armies. By now, he only has 6 elephants left. So out of 60, there's only 6. Takes the elephants, goes back. The battle is called the Battle of Zama, and of course, Rome wins. Okay, the Second Punic War. Okay, so Punic War number 2, Hannibal and the elephants, they invade Italy, but in the end, Rome is victorious. Okay, Punic War number 3. Okay, the only thing you have to know about this one is that Rome basically attacks Carthage. They send everything they can against Carthage, and the Romans are able to completely annihilate the Carthaginians. Okay, so Rome wins. Rome wins the Punic Wars, and Carthage, just as an FYI, is completely disappeared off the map. Okay, the Romans are pretty brutal in their victory. Okay, and so because the Romans never want to face another enemy like Carthage again, even though, okay, yeah, they destroyed them, it took 3 wars to do it, and, in some of these battles, they were pretty close, and I mean, like, they even actually made it into Italy and caused all kinds of destruction, okay? And so what Rome begins to do is they begin to expand. They change their military so that they become more and more aggressive. Okay, they realize that that is the only way that they're going to avoid having to face another city like Carthage. Okay, and so in addition to the previous disciplinary measures where you die if you do anything wrong. Okay, number 1. Rome begins to, and I use the fancy word conscripted. That just means the draft. All right, Rome begins to draft every able-bodied male at around 17, 18 years of age. Okay, so guys, if any of you are, that age, you would be drafted into the Roman military. Okay, number 1. You don't just serve for a year or 2 years or whatever. Your military service is for 10 years. Okay, so the Romans have just become, a very military society where pretty much every man, every able-bodied man, okay, is in uniform for at least 10 years. Okay, now, it's not only that. Like I said, the Romans become, they're already pretty, brutal towards their own soldiers to instill discipline, but the Romans become especially brutal to the people that they conquer, okay? So, for example, when I say that Carthage was literally eliminated off the map, it was, okay? When the Romans win that last battle, they take Carthage apart, brick by brick. They want to make sure that there is nothing left. All right? Nobody can ever rebuild. Okay? They poured salt in the area, in and around Carthage. Does anyone know what pouring salt on the land is going to do? Leo?
Some plants growing, right?
Yeah, nothing will ever grow again, at least for a while. Okay? And so if anyone gets the idea of, hey, let's rebuild Carthage, yeah, what are you going to eat? All right, nothing's going to grow. Okay, so yeah, the Romans were especially brutal when it came to that. Okay, now just as an FYI, there is a city called Carthage back there again, but it's not in the original spot. They had to rebuild it 100 miles away from where it actually used to be, and it's it's just a city. It's not didn't become like another Rome type of thing. Okay, just as a side note, I always like to throw this up. The general who led the Roman armies in the Third Punic War was a man named Scipio Africanus. Okay, guess what they named after him? That's where Africa gets its name, from the Roman general who led that final victory over Carthage. Okay, now when the Romans invade Greece, okay, just another example. Okay, the city of Corinth actually put up like the strongest defense against them. You know, they totally refused to surrender, and even after most hope was lost, okay? But eventually the Romans are victorious. In order to show the other Greek city-states what could await them if they also refused to surrender, they took every male over the age of 12 and killed them. Just flat out, just cut off their heads. Boom. Okay? And then every woman and every child that, under 12, they sold them all into slavery. They didn't care. All right? Just, we're not even going to keep you a slave. We're going to sell you to other people. All right? So that you're completely gone. Okay? And so when they go on to the next city-state that they're going to conquer, it's like, hey, Spartans or Athenians or, whatevers. Remember what we did to Corinth? Yeah. So if you don't want all of your males killed and all of your females and children sold off into slavery to never be seen or heard from again, you'll just give up now. Okay? And so many of the Greek city-states did. All right? They remembered the example of Corinth. Okay? Now, of course, a military society and a society that is growing so quickly doesn't necessarily do it without social problems, okay? And so we begin to see certain social issues, all right, that begin to happen, all right? Because while Rome is conquering Italy, okay, and once again, I know they weren't Italian yet, but it's the closest word I have. All right. The other people that they conquered were their fellow Italians. Okay. They were similar in in lifestyle and language and like all of this other stuff. Okay. But when they begin to conquer Carthage and Greece and other areas, now we are conquering foreigners, people who aren't like us. So the Republic is starting to have certain issues. Okay, now, just to explain what Rome's Republic was like, and if it looks at all familiar, it should, because the founding fathers basically looked to ancient Rome, and that's how they modeled parts of our government today, okay? So you had the main governing body, which was the Senate, and it was made up of anywhere between 300 and 600 senators, depending on the size. Obviously when Rome was just a teeny republic, it was fewer. As it grows and grows and grows, you have more senators, okay? Now, the senators were chosen from the wealthy, from the elite, from the upper class, okay? And those people were known as patricians, okay? Now, in order to vote, in order to be able to not only pick the representatives, but to be an actual representative, to be a senator, okay, you had to be part of the wealthy class and you had to own property, okay? Property ownership is like one of those things that even up until the 1850s was one of those things you had to have in order to vote type of thing. So, in this case then, the patricians are the upper class, okay? Now, you also have the assembly, which is for the poorer people, the common people in Rome, okay? Now, you still had to own property, but because you were common, because you were poorer, obviously you didn't own as much as the patricians, So you still owned property, but you didn't own as much, okay? Now, because, members of the assembly were part of the lower classes, when the assembly first was formed, there were 10 people, okay? And then later on, obviously it grows as, more and more people begin to make money and, you're able to buy property. So, you can buy certain land, but you can't buy as much as these guys, okay? And the average people were known as plebeians. Okay, now, that was it, okay? If you were the wealthy, you got to choose the senators, and the senators decided things. And if you were the common class, the lower class, and you owned just a little bit of property, then you got to pick assembly people to do, you know, whatever. Now, the republic was led by two people known as consuls. Typically, the consuls were chosen from the Senate, but on occasion, especially in the later republic, all right, as the assembly got bigger and bigger, on occasion you would have an assembly person be a consul. But there were always two, okay? So, kind of like an oligarchy type of thing, all right? Now, whenever there was a national emergency, okay, one of those consuls, typically the senior one, would take over, and they would be known as dicta, okay? This is where we get the word dictator from, where it's just one person calling all the shots. And then when the emergency was over, then the other consul, you know, the junior consul, then, you know, okay, we're back to, you know, making the decisions together type of thing, okay? So that was, you know, the Roman Republic, okay? And like I said, if it looks familiar, the founding fathers were basically like, hey, you know, they had two bodies, and one was the Senate, and I think we still call it the Senate, all right? And that this is where like the upper people are, and then over here is where like the lower people are, except like any good plagiarizer, of course, we don't call it the assembly. What do we call this on a national level? Oh, that's both of them together. So we have the Senate, and we also have, yes, the House of Representatives. You can't plagiarize like directly. So, you know, they change assembly to House of Representatives.
I think assembly sounds better.
Yeah. Well, and if you look at state governments decided, fuck it, we'll just keep it. So you do have, like in New York State, you do have the state Senate and you have the state assembly. Okay, so they actually kept the names, all right, type of thing. But yeah, it's basically based on the Roman setup. Okay, and no, we don't have consuls. This is the one thing where they changed. They're like, no, we can't let the rich and wealthy decide who's going to be in charge of everything. So we're going to have like a different body for that. We're going to have an executive, you know, yada yada. So there are some changes, but the bare bones, the idea, actually comes from the old Roman Republic. Okay, and so what begins to happen, okay, and it's one of those things that we see throughout history. If any of it looks familiar, there's a reason, because it's happened over and over again, okay? The wealthy, the patricians, okay, they begin to abuse their power and use their station and their privilege to accumulate more and more wealth. And they do this, you know, because I'm able to vote in a senator, and that senator then is going to do things and pass laws that will benefit the upper class, because remember, the senators are members of the upper class, and even, you know, even people in the assembly. I mean, yeah, I own a little bit of property, but I would really like to own more. You know, I have a little bit of power, but I would really like to have more, okay? And so, in this case, we begin to see that corrupt people begin to use the government and their government power to gain more power for themselves and more wealth for themselves, okay? One of the things that they begin to do is with that wealth and with that manipulation of economic stuff, the people that are poorer, okay, and don't have as much resources, they are forced to sell their land, all right, in order to make ends meet, okay? Now, remember, in order to vote, you need to have land. So by selling your land, you're not just like, okay, I don't have a house anymore, but I have a little extra cash, whatever, okay? You're also giving up your right to vote. And so little by little, okay, the wealthy are gaining more and more government power, all right? And so they're able to manipulate the laws even more, okay, so that it benefits them, right? Now, those citizens that have lost their land, obviously they can't farm anymore, they can't, they have nowhere to live, okay, we have a little bit of cash, so they basically start going into the cities and trying to find work, but, once again, not only is the system stacked against them, but now that they've lost their right to vote, they've lost the only avenue by which they could have, changed some of those policies, all right? Now, it's not to say that, people didn't try to stop this kind of manipulation, or that, everybody went along with it. One example, it just so happened that there were two consuls, Tiberius and Gaius, who were brothers. And both of them were like we're in charge of Rome, and we're also brothers, okay? Tiberius was assassinated, and then Gaius committed suicide, all right, or at least that's what we're told, okay, type of thing. And so they were out there trying to pass land reform laws to, keep these senators from continually, amassing and accumulating more and more wealth, all right? So what ends up happening, okay, and here is where we see the change and the downfall of Rome from a republic to an empire, okay? So what happens is average citizens can't rely on the government, okay? The few government people that try to do something are killed. Most of the senators are corrupt, and assembly people are losing their power bit by bit, okay? And so they go to the military. They turn to the generals for help. Okay, now, bless you. Back then, part of what motivated people and part of the reason for joining the military was that in addition to your regular pay, I suppose, you were allowed, the areas that you plundered and burnt and, whatever, you were allowed to keep, some of the people as slaves, or even better, and in this case, the generals begin to promise this, you were able to take over the land, like, okay, we just conquered this city, Alex really, really wants to stay here, so we'll let you have these two houses that you killed the owners, so house is yours, okay? Or this farm is yours now that nobody's here to use it, okay? And so, not only do you get land, but remember, with land comes the power to do what? Vote. All right, so now you get your voice back to be able to try to change the laws, type of thing. Oops. All right, so eventually what we see is that different generals now have private little armies because the people that they've recruited are loyal to them, not to the government, okay? The government's the one that has screwed them out of everything. These generals have promised them land and a share of the money, and by promising them land, they've also promised them the right to vote, and in many, many cases, they kept their promises, okay? We just conquered this land, so hey, take what you want, now it's part of us, and this is your reward for having served me loyalty, and boom, okay? Now, of course, you're not going to have a situation like that for very long because many of these generals, then not only do they fight the government, but they start to fight each other over control. We don't have time to talk about all of those wars, but we do see a period of about 50 years of nothing but civil war. Spoiler alert, a man named Julius Caesar, okay, who was responsible for the conquest of what today is called France during this time. He is able to raise, his own private army. And I mean, come on, France, give out land to whoever, pledge their loyalty to him. He becomes the victor. He is victorious. He is now in charge. He actually takes his army after the conquest. It was called Gaul back then. After the conquest of Gaul, he's able to take his army into Italy and quite literally overthrow the sitting Senate, the sitting consuls, and take power in Rome. All right? Now, Julius Caesar is not the first emperor. A lot of people think he is, okay? He's a dictator. I mean, yeah, he has the sole word, okay? But the Senate is still there, okay? He is trying to reform it, all right? So that, obviously to his favor, but, okay, he hasn't quite brought down this structure, okay? Now, I know I've had to skip over a lot, but in addition to taking over Rome, just FYI, Julius Caesar does a lot of things in his time as dictator. One of them, and probably the one that still affects us today, is the fact that he modified the Roman calendar from a 10-month system to a 12-month, okay? Which not only do we still keep today, but we actually still keep the names that the Romans used to use, okay? Why is it called June? Because it was named after the goddess Juno, okay? March, because it was named after the god Mars, all right? September, Sept, because it was the 7th month, okay? October, all right, octagon, octopus, it was the 8th month, okay? But Julius Caesar realized that it was like off and it was wrong and it didn't quite work. So he added 2 more months, all right? July, which he named after himself, Julius, and August, who he named after his adopted son, Augustus, okay? And so, yeah, okay? He did a bunch of other things, but that's the only kind of cool one, all right? Or a lot of stuff was cool, but anyways. Because of his attempts to change Roman government and because the senators saw themselves losing power, eventually he is assassinated on the floor of the Senate, okay? March 15th, the Ides of March, all right? Quite literally, okay? And so, he was known as Octavian as well, okay? He's the same guy as Augustus. But his son, his adopted son, takes over. And he basically vows revenge on everyone who was responsible for Julius Caesar's assassination. Okay? Now, we enter another period of civil war. Okay? Octavian is, in fact, able to defeat and kill every person who was responsible for Caesar's assassination, okay? But then a lot of Julius Caesar's old generals are like, just because you're his son doesn't mean you're qualified to take over, we're not a monarchy, type of thing, and, we're not gonna let you. And so then the second part of the Civil War is basically Octavian fighting other generals who also want to take power, okay? Now, long story short, okay, one of those generals is a man named Mark Antony. He teams up with Cleopatra, who is the queen of Egypt. Cleopatra, remember, great-great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter of Ptolemy, one of Alexander the Great's generals. Cleopatra is a Greco-Egyptian woman. They're the last group that he beats, okay? And so, at the end of all of this, the Republic is gone. We've eliminated all of this. All we have now is an emperor, and Rome is an empire, okay? Octavian is the first emperor, and he takes the name Caesar Augustus. Okay, now, sometimes people confuse and think Julius Caesar was the first, because in his honor, the title for all emperors becomes Caesar. Okay? So from this point on, it's Caesar and then whatever their first name was or is. Okay? Or whatever like king name they take. Okay? And it's not limited to just the Romans. The Germans, when they had a king, was known as Kaiser, which is the German word for Caesar. The Russians, when they had a king, their title was Tsar, which is the Russian word for Caesar. Okay, so it becomes pretty influential. All right. After Augustus wins, okay, Rome as an empire enters a 200-year period of peace and prosperity. Okay, so the empire was kind of good, I suppose. Okay, now I'm not going to ask you to memorize a lot of Latin. Those of you that went to Catholic school probably already know this, but you do need to know this phrase, Pax Romana, which is Latin for Roman peace. Okay. A lot of historians call it the Golden Age of Rome, but I want you to know the Latin name, all right? Pax Romana, all right? Why do we refer to it as that? Number one, for the next 200 years, there is no challenges to imperial authority, okay? No rebellions, other than a few minor skirmishes on occasion, and, there's going to be this weird little group in Jerusalem that kind of causes a little trouble with some weird carpenter guy. But other than that, okay, it is a very peaceful time, number one. Number two, it is a successful time, all right? Everyone is basically, the economy is well off. People, are buying, selling, trading, making money, living a good life for about 200 years, okay? Which, that is, pretty impressive, okay? It is during this time, and part of it is because Rome controlled the entire Mediterranean. There was literally no challenges to Roman authority. You don't need to know this one, but they referred to the Mediterranean as Mare Nostrum, which basically just means our ocean. Because, the only thing happening was Roman commerce and Roman society and Roman civilization. So in this 200 years of peace, the empire was able to establish itself, and this is actually where Rome achieves some of its greatest accomplishments, all right, during the imperial period. I'm going to stop right there and shut up, okay? It is Friday.